All right, so everybody found the chat button. So we're going to go ahead and jump off. We've got, like I said, we've got about an hour of great material for you here today, discussing reserves and building safety. I am, for those who don't know me, my name is Matt Queasley. I'm a professional engineer, a professional reserve analyst, and a reserve specialist. I've been doing reserve studies for about 22 years now. I'm the regional executive director for a nationwide firm called Reserve Advisors. We serve about 2,500 associations throughout the state of Florida and several thousand nationwide as well as some international work. All we do is reserve studies. So that's kind of our bread and butter. We do building inspections, and we'll talk a little bit about what a reserve study is today. But I'm also background in civil and environmental engineering, and also, like many of you, board member at the condominium where I live in Tampa, Florida. So hats off to you board members here today, taking some extra time to get educated. I always am appreciative of that volunteer time because I know what a well-paying and rewarding job that is as a board member. I've been doing it for a long time. So Chris, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself and take the first few slides.
All right, thank you, Matt. Chris Davies here, welcome again. I practice condominium law, cooperatives, homeowner associations, the whole gamut, primarily in Southwest Florida, although I'm part of a worldwide firm. We're actually part of the largest law firm in the world, but I practice primarily in Southwest Florida and occasionally in other parts of the state. This is a very important topic that we're going to discuss today. I had the honor of serving on the Florida Bar Condominium Law and Policy on Life Safety Advisory Task Force that was put together after the collapse of Champlain Towers South in Surfside, Florida last June, where the lives of 98 people came to an abrupt and horrible end. So since then, you have probably been thinking about, what does that mean for us? What does that mean for me as a director? I know we have some managers on today. What does it mean for our role as management? I know Matt and I have been getting questions from clients and prospective clients on that very question. So we're going to spend a little bit of time today talking about a couple of things that are really significant as a result of the Surfside tragedy. We'll also talk a little bit about what happened in the Florida legislature this year, because we were thinking that maybe we would be talking about some new legislation at a program like this. But I think that's probably, maybe we'll book that, Matt, for an anniversary date a year from today. So we'll see what next session brings. But before we get into the two reports, and there are two reports that are important here. There's an inspection report and a reserve studies report. And let's be clear that neither of these reports is a substitute for another. So you need not just the inspection report, which focuses on the physical components of the building, the structural components, the buildings, the pool deck, the seawalls, elevators, electrical systems, plumbing, HVAC systems. How well maintained are those? And then the other part of that is this reserves report, a reserves analysis that we're going to talk about in detail. Matt's going to really drill down on that. I think you'll really find that part of the program helpful and educational. That piece, obviously, a critical financial planning tool for the association, because it will give you a pretty accurate idea of future costs and the remaining useful life of critical components. And you need that information. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time. That'll be our main focus of our program today. But before we get into that, as a lawyer, I want to talk about fiduciary duty, because it's all keyed into that. As a member of a condominium association board, or if we have some cooperatives on today, if a member of a co-op board, or a homeowners association, but I suspect we have less HOAs on today because of the nature of the presentation, but we might have managers. All three of those entities governed by Florida statutes require that you have a fiduciary duty to the members. And that's a word that gets kind of thrown around. It sounds like a nice fancy lawyer word. We may have some idea of what it means, but what does it really mean? Have you ever really thought about that as a director? So the slide that you have in front of you now is a pretty good slide. Three duties here: duty of care, of loyalty, and a duty to act. And these duties, if you want to dig down a little deeper, are found in the Florida Not-for-Profit Corporation Act, section 617-0830 of the Florida statutes. The statute imposes three requirements: to act in good faith, which you'll see on that slide, in the blue slide, first item, with the care of an ordinary prudent person in like position would exercise. You'll see that in the green slide in the second one, and in the best interest of the association. Summarized really under the third of duty of care, sound business judgment. Sometimes you'll hear lawyers talk about the business judgment rule. So we move to the next slide. What is a fiduciary duty? We now move on to what I call the hows. So you need to discharge your fiduciary duty by relying on information and opinions and reports prepared by competent professionals in their field. This could not be any more critical in the areas that we're going to talk about today. If you'll see there, you'll see relying upon legal counsel, other professionals such as engineers, reservists and the like, and also maybe surprising to some, committees. But you've got to be careful with committees. Okay, there are some caveats I just want to point out based upon my long time serving of counsel for associations. Sometimes committees work very well, sometimes not so well. The board must be careful in giving the scope of a committee some level of precision. What are you asking the committee to do? Does the committee have the board's confidence? And is it reasonable to rely on what the committee tells you when they submit the report? In other words, did they do their homework? Did they do a thorough and diligent job? And the advantage of putting this work with the committee is you get to take advantage of some people in the community that for various reasons do not want to be on the board. Maybe they don't have the time, but they don't mind like a special assignment. They don't mind a limited gig. And we're blessed, certainly for me in my practice. I have folks that down in Naples and Fort Myers area that have great qualifications, spent 30 or 40 years doing some of these things. They may have been engineers, they may have been general contractors, they may have run their own business. They get it and they want to contribute. And when you involve committees, you get that level of expertise if you pick the right people. And you also get the benefit of further buy-in by members of the community. So the word gets spread. It's not just the board and the board against the residents wanting to do certain projects. You spread that load a little bit more and you get some further buy-in, and that can be helpful in explaining why we may need to engage in significant restoration projects within the building at some significant expense. Final caveat from Davies on committees is that make sure you get along with the people on the committee. I've had situations where boards want to undo committees because they didn't do exactly what they were supposed to do. We have a collision of egos. Imagine that in the association world, but it does happen. So, pick the people carefully and make sure they are capable of doing a good job. So another way of dealing with financial duties is to rely upon your management team. The advantage of the management team is that that's essentially point E of this slide that's in front of you, is that they are ongoing. I mean, obviously they could be terminated at some point in time, but often they're there for several years. Directors come and go. They get burned out. They decide to move to a different community. They may move on to their next phase in life, whatever it may be. But there's then a new learning curve for new directors who get elected and come to the board. And management can help that by having a continuing plan of action if you're in a situation where these repairs and replacement need to move forward over a period of time, because obviously these are often long-term projects, 3, 4, 5 years, and require some fairly long learning curve of knowledge. Management can provide that. We go to the next slide, Matt. Talking about that, there's a slide about fiduciary duty put out by Community Associations Institute, a nationwide trade organization. The role of the board is to protect and increase property values. We all need to see that happen. It's accomplished by operating the association, maintaining the common property, and enforcing the governing documents. Maintaining the common property is often something that maybe doesn't get quite the attention that it should in terms of developing a formal protocol. And that's very important to do. I think we've got new emphasis on establishing a maintenance protocol. The Condominium Act is surprisingly quiet on establishing a maintenance protocol. And Matt's put up a slide there that talks a little bit about that. And it's not just the necessity to develop a protocol for the members, but also for your insurance folks, for the secondary market. I'll talk a little bit about that in a few more minutes. But when we talk about the maintenance protocol, there's also the component piece of who's going to do the work and are they qualified to prepare an inspection report for you. And later on, we'll talk about the qualifications of doing a reserve study. But let's first of all, as part one of this webinar today, talk about the inspection report. So Matt, it's not clear in even in the proposed legislation, but it's not clear today, what is an inspection? I mean, is this an eyeball inspection? Is this a drive-by inspection? Is this walk around and say, oh, it looks pretty good, paint looks good, looks clean, looks nice. Or is there an obligation here to do something greater and deeper in scope? Do we have to go to the sophistication and expense of, I believe, what engineers call global penetrating radar testing to make sure that everything is structurally sound? So could you address a little bit about qualifications of inspectors and scope of work? Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Chris, and great information. And I certainly will talk about inspection. Just one more thing on the fiduciary, that slide from CAI reminded me, that the board's job is to protect and enhance the values, and in nowhere in any of the statutes that I'm aware of, I always like to ask the attorneys when I get to share some time with them, Chris, I don't think anywhere that I've read is the board's job is to keep the association fees as low as possible. Yet I spend so much time, and I'm sure a lot of us do in board meetings, trying to figure out ways to save a few pennies here or a few dollars there off of our association fees. But it sometimes, and it's okay as long as it's not at the detriment of that overall value of keeping the property values high. And that's really, I think, why inspections and a lot of the maintenance protocols that we just talked about sometimes are neglected, is because they do cost money, and they are sometimes lead to finding additional repairs that additionally cost money. And no one likes to spend money if we don't have to. Well, we know as fiduciaries and having that duty of care, the duty to act, that's, we have that heavy duty, that heavy responsibility, that board hat to do it. So what is it that we're talking about? Well, you kind of hit the nail on the head, Chris, and that a lot of great questions about what is an inspection, what type level of inspection should be done. The different governing bodies, building departments, the legislators in Tallahassee kind of struggled with this as well. What level do we need to impose inspection requirements? At this time, there are still a few counties, Miami-Dade and Broward County, that still have the 40-year building certification. They're going to make some changes. They have been making some changes there. There's also a few additional municipalities in the wake of Surfside that have added additional inspection requirements. And generally those are safety inspections, visual inspections that bear the stamp and the seal of a professional engineer or architect. Most of them are limited inspections. So Chris asked about, the ground penetrating radar, the testing, the destructive testing, the sounding. Not all of those are required at surface level for all community or for all buildings, all associations, certainly not throughout the state, but even in some of these counties. What the legislature proposed, and we'll talk about a couple of the different proposals here today, but what they proposed this spring in Tallahassee was a couple of bills, Senate Bill 1702 and House Bill 7069, which really were the advance. They kind of turned into the omnibus bills, if you will, for a lot of this material. And they both proposed required milestone inspections for buildings 3 stories or greater and over 3,500 square feet. So most of our condominium buildings, even a lot of the townhome buildings are 3 stories. So they really proposed this on a lot of buildings. And it was a 2-phase inspection. So the first phase, which I think is very logical, is to do a visual, non-destructive, non-invasive test. So looking at the areas of the building for signs of fatigue, water infiltration, signs of cracks or spalls, perhaps structural components that may be showing wear and tear throughout the building. And so the wording was such in the statutes, and I would expect, just to be clear for those that don't know, the statutes that we're talking about, the bills that we're talking about, sorry, did not become statute. They did not become law this year. I'm sure most of us know that, we've heard it on the news, but they certainly will be back in some way, shape, or form next year. I think we're very confident that these issues are not going away. But as Senator Bradley said, I think on the Senate floor the last day of the session, that 60 days of a session is just not enough to pass sweeping condo reform. Some things just take longer. So we expect these things to get reintroduced. So we thought it would be good to cover what was there and the issues, so that you as board members and managers can prepare for this and kind of know what to look for in those legal updates that we may get next year about, like Chris said, about a year from now. But their proposals in both proposals ended up very close on the inspection side. We're both 2-phase inspections, first phase being a visual inspection, second phase only needed if the visual inspection identified areas of concern. So that allows you to target in the more detailed inspections. It would be very cost prohibitive, and I think that's something that we obviously balance as board members had already talked about this, but the legislature was conscious of this as well, and that they didn't want to say that every single building had to have top to bottom ensured that every piece of steel, reinforcing steel that's in that building, was in the exact right spot. That would be quite cumbersome. There's definitely specifications for doing inspections like that, and they may be needed if there's a defect concern or if construction was not supervised. But they didn't want to put something like that, I don't think, in place to every single building. So it starts with a visual inspection, then it might go to more invasive inspection, and that might be not necessarily destructive, but sounding. So hammer testing, chain dragging to determine areas of concrete that maybe have voids in it or show some sign of delamination. And we're not going to get into all that today, of the science of that, but certainly we can have other courses if you're interested on those types of topics. But what they propose is that visual inspection followed by a more invasive inspection as needed. And so the phase 1 inspection, they called it the milestone inspection, was going to be needed at 30 years for all buildings, again, 3 stories or greater, and 20 years if it was within, I believe it was 2 or 3 miles of the coastline. And then updates every 10 years thereafter that, unless it was within the coastline, at 7 years. And the thinking behind this is, 40 years, which was what the current municipalities and counties have put in place, is too long to wait on some of our waterfront buildings, especially because those extreme environments can corrode our steel and buildings faster than 40 years. So waiting a long time is never a good thing. And when you talk about maintenance protocols and inspections, is probably something most buildings are going to do even sooner. One of the other issues that the legislature tried to address was that the the reports currently, if we have an inspection, say an engineer does a report or we do a reserve study, there's no obligation to distribute that report to either the building department or all the owners. So they added some language in here about the inspector, the engineer must furnish the report and the board, the report to the board and the local building officials. The board must distribute it to all owners at a very rapid time frame. I think there was like 7 days or something one of the bills had to get this information out to the building officials. And then it becomes a record of the subject inspection, official record of the community, and also should be furnished to prospective buyers by the selling unit owner. That was all required in one of the bills. So none of that passed, but we do expect that to come in place. A couple of the other bills that we talked about had requirements for reserve studies. So reserve studies, as Chris mentioned, is not a full engineering study, but it does have some similar aspects. I think there's some overlap here, but neither one would be a full substitute for the other. The reserve study is a long-term capital planning tool that identifies the fund status and a funding plan for repairs and replacements of items as they occur. So this is more of a budget tool as opposed to an engineering inspection, which is what is the current condition typically right now in this building? Are additional repairs needed today to the structure? The reserve study often includes a lot of items that you wouldn't see in a structural report, things like carpet and elevators, air conditioning equipment. It really looks at all of the common elements of the property. And I see some questions in. Please do feel free to put the questions in. We've got a few more slides, and then we're going to take some time here towards the end of the presentation to answer questions. So thank you for bringing those in. But like I mentioned, the reserve study is two-part analysis, a physical analysis, which is similar to those building inspections we were talking about. Usually the reserve study is not going to include any of that phase 2 work, any of the destructive testing. Typically the reserve analysis is just a physical, a visual observation for the physical analysis, and then the financial analysis. The main sticking point that I've been told of the bills and why really it could not pass in its current form is that we could not agree on how we were going to fund these. I think everyone, especially in the wake of Surfside, says yes, we have to be more aggressive with how frequently we look at our buildings. We have to be able to identify these repairs. But then what? What happens when we identify the repairs? The towers of, the Surfside property had the Champlain Tower South had an inspection. They had understood that there was a large project like 3 years prior to passage or prior to the collapse. And what they realized then was it was several $1 million of work. And as it approached, it became even more. I think it was close to 15 or 16 $million was the last estimate that we saw from those board meetings. So how are we going to fund it? And that was the concern from a lot of our legislatures, a lot of the constituents, is, are we going to be required to now increase our association fees to the level that we have to have money on hand for every project? And when do we have to have that money on hand? Are we going to be mandated to fund it? Is there going to be allowance to waive reserves? So currently for a condominium in the state of Florida, you can waive the reserves with a majority of the owners at a quorum of the meeting. So you might have, so you got a 100-unit building. If the quorum is 20, you just need 11 votes of the 100 to waive reserve funding completely. And that was something that came under heavy scrutiny, of course, in looking at the Champlain Towers case study. However, so the legislature has to kind of come up with, okay, well, what are we going to require? And there's not a lot of precedent for this, and it's a bit nuanced. So I'm going to refer to the 4 funding goals that are identified by the National Reserve Study Standards. Those are developed by Community Associations Institute, Chris mentioned, a nationwide trade organization that does education and designations for managers, reserve study professionals, etc. Anyway, so they identified these four goals, and I think they're all pertinent here. Full funding, which is defined by CAI as achieving and maintaining a 100% funded reserve balance. In Florida, historically, we've not used that exact same definition when we say, are my reserves fully funded? There we talk, what we're really saying in most cases colloquially is that, are my reserves waived? Did I waive the reserves or not? And when we don't waive the reserves, the default is say, okay, well, we're fully funding the reserves. but in most cases, we're not achieving a 100% fully funded balance. Talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Other goals, threshold funding. This is when we look at a cash flow and we say the cash flow never falls below a certain dollar amount over the term of the schedule. Baseline funding says that very similar to the cash flow, but it never falls below zero over the length of the schedule. And the fourth goal they identified is statutory funding. There are some states that have specific requirements, such as you have to get a reserve study and follow what the reserve study says, or one state says you have to set aside 10% of your operating budget for reserves. So in Florida, that doesn't really apply right now because all three of these other goals are acceptable under the current statutes of Florida. One of the proposed bills did say that there had to be a schedule for the full funding of the reserves and described it as the full 100% reserve funding balance. So then the question becomes, okay, well, that has to be the goal. How much is that going to cost? So I ran a case study here for us for you to see. This is a 130 unit condominium, 28 years old. We did a study for them. They had about 1.1 million in the reserves to start. And that meant they were 38% funded. Percent funded is basically the ratio of funding to the amount of life that's used up. So if an item is halfway through its life and you have half of the cost, it would be 100% funded. If an item is halfway through its life and you have a quarter of the cost, it would be 50% funded. In this particular case, all of the elements are added together, and that's how you calculate it. All the elements added together, and in this case, they were 38% funded, which is not uncommon at all for a community to have about 38% of the total of all of the items accumulated in their bank account as a balance at one time. Of course, this can range all across the board, but 38% was not uncommon, not an uncommon number for the communities that we work with. So this is kind of a representative sample, and we identified about $5 million of expenses over the next 20 years. This schedule that you see here is kind of the expense profile. So the red bars are when the expenses happen. You can see some years they're spending $500,000, some years they're spending almost nothing. Very common for an association to go through this over time. Some years of bigger expenses, some years were smaller. So then what we do for these is we say, okay, what's the funding plan have to be? Well, if we wanted to get, in this particular case, we wanted to get to a fully funded balance, and we wanted to get there in 2 years, it would require very large initial contributions to take the community from 38% funded to 100% funded over 2 years. It would be, in this case, it would have been over $570 a month per unit for the first 2 years to reach that 100% funded level. And then the association could decrease to about $291,000 per year. And that would maintain them at a 100% funded level. But you'll see the balance goes from 1.1 very quickly up to 2 million, 3 million, and beyond, all the way up to over 3.5 million towards the end of the study. So the contributions that were required for this community were over $7.4 million over 20 years to fund their $5 million of expenses. I'm showing you this. I truly believe that in most cases, trying to achieve this 100% funded balance, if you were looking at this as a board member, you'd say this is likely too much. It's too much in the bank at any one time based on our expenditures. But again, this was one of the proposals of the statute. So we got to look at this, and we're going to work to hopefully change the approach on this. And it didn't really say how long we had to get there. So I ran a couple other scenarios. If we took 5 years to get to 100% funded, of course, the initial 5-year contributions are lower. This increase was about $269 per month per unit. And again, after that, $291,000, because once they've reached that 100% threshold, then they can drop the balance down. But again, you'll see the balance is still very high throughout the study, still contributing $7 million over 20 years to fund a $5 million worth of expenses. Here's over 10 years. You can see the increase goes down to $176 a month. So the longer you give, and here's 20 years, the longer you give your communities to reach 100% funded balance, the more stable the funding becomes. And in this case, if we said, okay, we've got all 20 years to reach the 100% funded balance, we can contribute a level amount of $375,000 and get there by year 20. We're still, probably only 40% funded in year 2, 45% midway through, and we're gaining on that number to get to 100% funded towards the end of the 20-year schedule. So that's so these are those examples are all what full funding is. Threshold funding was introduced in 2002 in Florida to allow what we call this pooled reserves. But what they did then is it allowed us to look at, okay, what is a more adequate threshold to obtain to keep the reserves at? And here in this example, again, the same condo, same expenditure profile, but you can see the balances are much lower. The blue line is the reserve balances. They really hover between $500,000 and $1 million, because there's no need to really have more cash than that at any one time. So we call this threshold funding. We think it's adequate, stable, and not excessive cash flow. It's a much more moderated amount. So again, for the same community, we were seeing contributions over $1 million a year to get to that full funded, 100% funded in the first couple of years, and now we've got it all the way down to $235,000 a year, which this was an increase of just $29 per month per unit. So this would be what I would recommend as a reserve professional, and most in our industry would say this is a reasonable, adequate, stable cash flow. This is allowed currently by Florida statutes currently. So we can do this threshold funding. We don't have to go to full funding. It's a much more, probably a better use of the funds as opposed to having a ton of money in hand at any one time. And then the last example, the last goal that I'll show you here is baseline funding. What's the minimum level? And baseline funding just says that, this reserve balance can go all the way down to $0. As long as it doesn't drop below zero, you're still considered to be, adequately funded according to the budget. You don't have to call for a waiver of reserves. So this is like the minimum. And I typically would say this would be too risky. I wouldn't recommend draining your reserves that low for these projects, but this is allowed currently under Florida Statute Administrative Code. Would be the bare minimum funding level, $8 per month per unit as an increase. So you can see the wide range of what this would mean internally, depending on what goal you set out for as a reserve study provider, and when you're doing your reserve schedule. Switching gears just a little bit, one of the things we see, well, of course, when we go back to these plans where we're accumulating millions of dollars, you're going to get the comment, why would we accumulate this? We're not going to be here in 20 years. You may get that now, even with your minimum, even if you did the bare minimum. Why would we worry about this expense? We're going to have $500,000 in the bank for the next 10 years. I'm not going to be here any longer than that. Why would I pay for that? I don't even buy I don't even go to the grocery store and buy green bananas, right? Because I don't think I'm going to be here to enjoy them. Have you guys heard this? Anybody hear this in their board meetings? I'm sure you have. Why would we worry about that? And I just remind people, when I hear that, I hear it all the time. When I hear that, we go back to our fiduciary duty. We go back to understanding the obligations of the board and try to get them to turn it around from saying, I'm not going to be here, to, is the Condominium Association Incorporated going to be here? Because that's the hat that you're wearing when you're in those board meetings. And it kind of goes against, again, that desire to keep the fees necessarily as low as possible, but we look out for what's needed for the community in the long term. So just a couple kind of a recap of the reserve study part. We think that the board, there's benefits for the board, of course. For this, it minimizes the risk of special assessment or having to go for a loan. It allows you to get the projects done. And as a board member, you can hear, you've heard this as well too. Like, if we have the money, let's do the project, let's get it done. When the money's not there, it's a much harder thing to do for the board to do its job, because we have to now come up with some other alternate source, or perhaps push a project off that really needs to be done. But in those homeowners, they don't have that fiduciary duty. So the homeowners are going to be the ones saying, I don't buy green bananas. I'll write a check when it gets here, but don't make me set aside any more money in my association fees than I absolutely the bare minimum. Well, there's benefits as well to having a reserve, and really it's protecting your investment. We're going to talk a little bit about mortgage, but mortgage companies are looking much closer at the financial health of the community. So having the reserves, doing these repairs, doing your inspections, doing your maintenance protocols are really going to help you understand the fair share, understand the cost of living in a community. So you're right sized in that aspect, and also ensure that everyone pays their fair share, whether they're living there for a long time or not. One of the common concepts we think about is, you're not necessarily paying for that roof or whatever it is 20 years from now. You're paying for its useful life, its consumption of its useful life that's happening today. It's wearing out. It's sitting in the Florida sun. It's losing some of its flexibility, and it's losing a piece of its life. So let's continually put some funds into the reserve to counteract the wear and tear and the benefit that we're all seeing from it now. And the last one, and Chris, you may want to touch on this too, just a little bit about how this can really promote the leadership, trust in the leadership, promote, like you said before, kind of communicating to the members, what the plan is, and understanding their decision, to build some confidence from the membership in the board.
Absolutely. And before you go to the next slide, Matt, there's a couple of really important points here, that you've mentioned. I'm going to re-emphasize them because they're important. Promotes trust in leadership, halfway down on the blue box there. The last item in the brown orange box, understanding board decisions. It's not the board's community, it's everyone's community. Everyone has a significant investment, and everyone has to pay the price to continue to have the beautiful facilities that you have in your project. But when it gets ignored for too long, that creates a real problem. And then boards, unfortunately, and it's dangerous to make broad generalizations, but for purposes of this webinar, we're going to do that to have a teaching moment. But when boards don't engage, and if we go to the next slide, Matt, if they don't engage in transparency and disclosure, then we have a problem that brews in the community.
Okay.
So there's the slide. Boards must intentionally engage in transparency and disclose what is going on to the owners. And this can get everyone in a lot of trouble. You don't want to wake up one morning as an owner and say, I've been here 15 years. I didn't know this was going on. I can see that we've got some maintenance issues, but I didn't think it was a $20 million problem. There's no reason for that. There's no reason for the directors to shoulder that burden year after year after year. But you know how it goes, folks. I mean, boards come in, they start to deal with this, it gets a little hot, and then they resign because they came down here and to play golf, to enjoy the water, to play pickleball, to do all those great things, and not necessarily to be burdened by all of these things. I mean, I've had directors tell me I used to go out and enjoy walking my dog, but I don't do it anymore because every time I go out, I get accosted by somebody asking me about why aren't we doing this and why aren't we doing that? And you guys know that, managers certainly know that, but shoulder the burden, share it. So when we do these reports, the inspection report and the reserve studies, they're not something you just keep in-house with the board members. Push them out to the owners too. You can distribute them. A lot of associations now have websites with member-only login. You can post these to the website. Have meetings. They don't have to necessarily be formal meetings. They can be town hall meetings. They can be informational meetings. And when you interview prospective engineers, reservists, and the like, ask if they're willing to come and talk to the members. Some folks don't want to do that. Some folks, even in their middle age, are terrified about standing up in front of a crowd of 50 to 100 people or more and talking about what may be for some an uncomfortable subject, that is money, the cost of repair. But so I would encourage boards to make sure that you get something in writing in advance that says that, okay, we hire you, part of the scope is going to be for you to come and explain this, because those folks can explain it, but much better than even the most well-intentioned director. So, and there's often more than one solution. Matt, I think you'd probably agree with this as an engineer yourself, that it's not a one size fits all sometimes. There are different ways of doing things. There's different ways of phasing repairs and whatnot. There are new products coming out. Rebar isn't the only thing. There are polymers, there's vinyl, there's all sorts of things that are coming on the market. That's why I'm stressing that you can use the committee to take a deeper dive into that. But also asking, when you interview the engineers, what is the approach? And if someone says that's the only approach, then maybe you need to think about talking to a couple of other folks and seeing if that's true. Ask them, before you hire them, ask them what other experiences they've had in other communities, in your neighborhoods. Go talk to those other board members, see if they did a good job, see if they came in on time, see if they had good proposals. And remember that when you start getting into construction contracts to repair things, I don't want to get beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, but it's related enough to remind directors that construction contracts generally should be reviewed by legal counsel. If they're using AIA contracts, AIA has a lot of good language in it, but it's pretty sophisticated stuff. And it has provisions regarding insurance, hold harmless language, choice of venue, choice of law. You don't want to find out that the contract has to be litigated or mediated in Nevada. And it's not for the directors necessarily spot that. That's why you should have legal counsel review construction contracts, especially there for significant amounts of money. But involve these folks, have them come to meetings, have them come to town halls, and disclose. Okay, I think I made my point there, Matt. So we can go to the next slide. So we mentioned this in passing in my opening remarks. There are other issues that go beyond the world of the condominium building that relate to what we're addressing here, that are nationwide issues. And these issues are not only having ramifications in Florida, but they're having ramifications across the country. And as I'm sure you all know, you've heard of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which is the secondary market for financing. That's where paper is sold for, mortgage paper is sold, and they have standards. And in October, they sent out sort of emergency rules about whether they would approve projects or not. They codified those rules in a report in what's called a bulletin. I don't think you can see this, but it says a bulletin by Freddie Mac. This is the one from December 15th of 2021. And they basically say that if projects are in need of critical repairs, they're not going to provide financing for those projects. And they're going to want to see the following things. I'll just read it verbatim. Homeowner association or cooperative board meeting minutes, engineer reports, reserve studies, list of necessary list of necessary repairs provided by the association or management company, and other substantially similar documentation. And they do go on to say that these requirements do not apply to routine repairs and maintenance, or damage or deferred maintenance to one or two units in the project. But the point is that the secondary market is now very concerned to make sure that the failure to not do the repairs doesn't go on year after year after year. And we just cannot allow that to happen. And I know that most of you on this webinar today are not involved with buildings like that, but maybe one or two of you are. Maybe in order to continue to preserve the value of your units, there may be more that needs to be done. And the lending market now is generally requiring that they see at least 10%, and that's obviously not enough given what you've heard from Matt today as to how these reserve studies are done. 10% of the annual budget pledged must be for reserves. So the secondary market is not a fan of waiver. And as Matt said, waiver may be perfectly permissible in Florida law, which it is. And I have, my favorite slide in the slide deck is the green bananas, because we hear that all the time. I'll take care of my own money, thank you. Association, you run the place, and when you need money, tell me and I'll write you a check. I've been hearing that since I started practicing in Naples, Florida in 1985, when I heard green bananas from the first time when I was a 20-something baby lawyer. Not much has changed in those years. So it's important for that. And there's another part to this is insurance. And I just finished last week presenting to the American Bar Association National Real Estate Convention in Dallas, Texas, with another lawyer who handled the Hard Rock Cafe collapse in New Orleans, and also two senior vice president insurance brokers, one from Chicago, one from Denver, so a nationwide panel that I was moderating and speaking on. And insurance companies are not going to wait for the Florida legislature to act. You all know this. You all know that policy premiums are increasing, maybe even going through the roof. You probably know that Governor DeSantis has called a special session of the Florida legislature to discuss insurance, reinsurance, and possible changes to the building codes to be held later this month. So we'll see what comes of that. So stay tuned to your media outlets and to people like me and Matt as to what comes from that legislative session. There's no plan, as far as I know, and I think, Matt, you don't know anything on this either, to discuss Surfside related matters. That'll have to wait till 2023. But the insurance companies are not going to wait. So it's important that you involve, as part of your fiduciary duty, your insurance broker in what is going on. Invite your insurance broker to talk about insurance coverages. Invite them to I have one client, they invite their insurance agent to the annual meeting every year. And in 10 or 15 minutes, she does a pretty good job explaining insurance coverages, which is hard to do in that period of time. And explains the association coverages, the HO6 coverages. But there should always be a deeper dive on the coverages that are required by Florida law. There are coverages that are required by your declaration of condominium, usually broken down into required coverage and optional coverage. Want to make sure you have enough, because as I learned on my presentation with the American Bar Association last week from one of the insurance experts that was on, that there was $30.1 million worth of coverage, I believe under the CGL at Champlain Towers South, and the replacement cost was for that building was approximately $50 million. So this has gotten the attention of the insurance industry, make no doubt about that. So changes are coming, and it's going to get more expensive in light of post Surfside. Let's see. I think we're ready to move on to the next slide. Matt, do you want to talk about some responses?
Yep.
I was on one of these task forces, so I'll keep quiet.
Yep. And I was lucky enough to present to that task force, so I appreciate it.
Yes, you were. We very much appreciated your presentation.
Yes. These are just some of the responses, and I think we've kind of touched on these, so I'm going to go through them very quickly here. When the building collapsed, of course, everyone responded quickly, saying, what are we going to do to make sure this never happens again? And we saw three. This is just three of the groups. There were many more municipalities and other groups that came together with some ideas. And so this is just a kind of high level summary of what these task force and study groups proposed. And again, we saw some of this adopted in the statute. So again, quick recap of the Senate bill that we saw that required two-phase milestone inspections. required reserve studies every 5 years, but Senate Bill 1702 did allow for the waiver of the reserves with the majority of the voting interests. As that went on through the session, I did see that there was an amendment to take this up to 2/3 of the voting interest. So if you remember, currently it's a majority of a quorum of the members. Then this is saying, regardless of who shows up at the meeting, if it's a 100-unit community, you'd need at least half or at least 2/3 of those members to say, yes, we approve waiving the reserve. So really raised the bar there, but not high enough for the House, which went even further. And waivers would never be allowed for some of the life safety items. They ended up calling out some specific items. They identified a term called the structural integrity reserve study that would reserve for all the items listed in the developer turnover report. So it kind of tied back to when a condo was initially inspected. There's a list of components that the disclosures have to be made on their condition and useful life. And it kind of maintained that schedule for them. Like I said, neither of these passed, and I think a lot of it was based on the waiver and really what those funding goals were. While we're on the waiver, we did have a question, Chris, from the audience, and I think I know the answer, but I'm going to defer to the attorney here. Can the condo docs transfer the right to waive reserves to a majority of the board? Was the question, and I said,
Yep.
I don't think so, but what do you think?
Absolutely not. That's under the statute. It's a novel approach. I admire your creativity, but it's not going to win the day. So that's a statutory requirement under the Florida Condominium Act. Majority vote of the owners present at a duly called meeting, either in person or voting by proxy. So it's a question that should probably almost always be on the limited proxy that you have either at the annual meeting or at the special meeting if you do this before the end of your fiscal year, which may not tie into your annual meeting. So no, can't transfer it to the documents. Interesting idea. Matt, I know we both know, and I'm assuming everybody on the call knows, that the waiver issue was a real stumbling block by the Florida legislature. I would like to say that there was a huge effort and a very prompt response by a lot of folks in the legislature and in various trade associations, the Florida Bar, the engineers, and the like, to address Surfside issues pretty much right out of the gate. So there was an awful lot of work done, and I'm certainly appreciative of everything that anyone who made a meaningful contribution to this did last year, including the members of the Florida legislature. You're right. This legislature sits for 60 days, and they have an awful lot of very, very important work to do, including the budget and dealing with, the pandemic during the last session. So, we shouldn't hold any fault on the part of the legislature. I think it's actually good that we have a little bit of breathing room, because I think it allows us to not rush, as our mothers taught us, haste makes waste. So I think now, we can step back a little bit and see what works here. But I think some type of mandatory reserve funding, I noticed that when I was preparing for the American Bar Association presentation last week, that the Maryland General Assembly has just passed a new law requiring that a reserve study be done and it be renewed every 3 years. So here's Maryland, and usually Florida is kind of waving the trail on creating the trail on a lot of these types of issues. But Maryland has done something that requires these reserve studies. So I think we're going to see some fundamental changes in this area. And as I said earlier, Matt, I think we'll be back a year from now to talk about those changes.
Yep. Very good. I'm going to go through, I think that we have one more slide, just our summary slide, but I'll go through, we got a few minutes for a few questions here. One of the questions commonly asking, what does it cost to have a new reserve study done? I can't really answer that in a group like this. It's really the cost of the study is based on the time that the engineer would spend on it. If you want to send me a note, we can learn a little bit about your complex, and happy to give a quote. But some of them are much more expensive than others, just because the building may be older, have more amenities, more complexity. It's all based on the time that an engineer or the reserve analyst spends on the project. A couple of questions about the slides. Yeah, if you want to just email me, I put my email in the chat. I'll do that again here. I'm happy to send the slides. A question about composite and barrel mansard decorated roof that appears to be disintegrating. Can the engineering inspection be used for product defect insurance claim? I would say you may not have to, probably unable to answer that in this type of a setting as well. It probably would encourage you to discuss that maybe with your defect, maybe with your engineer or your even a defect attorney, right, Chris? There's attorneys that can help kind of guide whether or not the statute of limitations is expired on that.
Correct. There was a question there I saw, Matt, about, it's an interesting question about new items when you do a reserve study or something that is to be reserved for in the future, something that bought a new product or a capital expenditure.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that? Because this is focused on stuff that already exists that is deteriorating, but maybe there's a new amenity or what have you that's going to cost quite a lot of money. When do we start reserving for that?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I saw that one from Sandy as well. Generally, reserves they're defined now as reserves for capital expenditures, which is replacement of an item, or deferred maintenance, which is repair to an item. I am of the belief that a community could have a savings account for improvements that they may want to add. If they want to add here, electronic pool cover as the example, you could say one of the common ones I'm seeing is pickleball courts. Wanting to add something like that. I think you could probably have a savings account for it, but it would not. I don't think it would meet the definition of reserves, and I wouldn't put that in your reserve study. But once it is in place and you fund its replacement from some other capital campaign, then certainly you can add it to the schedule and should add it to the schedule for its upkeep, its deferred maintenance and capital expenditure.
So I'm continuing to get a lot of questions on the slide deck. Yeah, we'll send it out. And Matt's the point person on this. If you have something that is more in the legal arena, you can send it to me. I may or may not be able to answer it unless you're a client. I do have some clients on the call, but my email is as my name is spelled out. If you can see my picture, Christopher, spelled the traditional way, Christopher.Davies@Dentons, DENTONS.com, Christopher.Davies@Dentons.com. Thank you.
I'm adding that to the chat here as well.
Okay.
And mine again.
Thank you. So I guess it's kind of stay tuned, Matt, right? In case something interesting comes out of the special session later this month. And certainly we'll see what happens when committees start meeting later in the year as they ramp up for the session in 2023.
Yeah, exactly. And in the meantime, we're looking at other municipalities, the lenders and the insurance, they're kind of filling in maybe some of these same requirements that we're seeing. There was a question about, can we do a study now? And then what if the statute enacts something else that is needed? Would the old study comply? Maybe not. It really depends on what's going to actually become required. But I do think that whether or not statutorily it's required, because of the need for us to be prudent fiduciaries of our community, having some of these common sense best practices in place are going to benefit all your communities. And benefit all of them. A lot of great questions. Again, I'll try to, I think I have your emails. I'll try to email some of these. We'll have to do another one of these. Like Chris said, I want to be respectful of everyone's time here over the lunch hour. And so it's 1 o'clock. So I'm going to go ahead and sign off. But again, feel free. Our contact information is in here, and I'll do my best to respond to some of you here either today or tomorrow with the slides and other information. We'll also be doing a recording of this session that we can send out if you'd like to share that with the rest of your boards. But I just want to thank you again on behalf of Chris. Thank you, Chris, for the time and putting this together. This was a great idea, a lot of fun, and I hope that it was very valuable for those in attendance. Thank you for your time.
Thank you all. Be well.